Tonight's You and Your Money is brought to you by Save the Bays and Anyway Insurance.
Good evening and welcome to You and Your Money. I'm Tanya Wright, and tonight's guest will be the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration, the Honorable Fred Mitchell. Minister, good afternoon, good evening.
Oh, evening, great to be here.
All right, we're going to be talking today about your ministry has been very, very busy in the press, and I'm sure got you all tied up. We're going to be talking, first of all, about what your ministry is all about. What's the scope of the ministry, and what does it do?
Well, the one that's of the most importance to Bahamians, of course, is the passport. I think most people don't think of foreign affairs at all until there's an issue with passports or some border passage, like if you have a problem with visas. So there's that aspect of it. The more general work of the ministry has to do with the relations with foreign countries, the maintenance of our overseas missions, relations with Bahamians who live abroad, and then, of course, the immigration side has to do with the entry of people into the country and the issuance of work permits.
Right. Now, this would be the second time that you've held the post as Minister of Foreign Affairs, in particular, and Immigration and others. Has anything much changed from one administration to the other? I'm talking about from the times that you were there to when you came back. Have you seen much change in how the ministry operates, the scope of its involvement, and generally speaking, what changes from one administration to the next?
Well, if I thought that, over this past week my mind's been changed because it's like deja vu. I mean, because we had the same situation back in, I think it's 06, you know, again, Cuban Americans exercised about the situation here. And we obviously didn't learn very many lessons from it because the fact is people simply take too long to get processed through the detention center. And so I'm committed this time to just eliminating all of that if I can.
Well, the issue with the Cuban immigrants obviously is a hot topic now from an international standpoint and locally. I wonder if you can help us to understand exactly what this controversy is all about.
Not sure, really, except that it's driven by a group of well-connected people in South Florida. And I don't think it has much traction beyond Broward County and Dade County.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the people who have been engaged in it on a U.S. national level in the States have really been politicians all tied to Dade County and Broward County.
All right. Well, you're generally known to be a very cool and level-headed politician, but you did seem to be very frustrated by the direction that this discussion was going. Can you explain why it affected you so passionately this time?
Well, yeah, I think passionate is probably the better word because I'm not frustrated about it at all. I mean, you know, it has no psychological impact on me. This is just, you know, occupational in nature. It's something that happens. But I think that I don't suffer fools gladly. And my view is that, that this is a lot of rot, which is just generated by some people who have an agenda. I can't figure out what the agenda specifically is, except it may be politically motivated in the States. The fact is that any allegation made against the Bahamas as supporting torture, cruel and inhumane punishment is simply misdirected and untrue. And if you continue to repeat that, then I'm going to be very forceful in response to it. Now, individuals may make errors of judgment, may do things which are unlawful, who are agents of the state. But my view is that that is their individual behavior, and if there's an investigation and it turns out that they did something which is criminal or wrong by way of discipline or something of that nature, then the system has a mechanism to deal with that. In the process, though, you don't defame the Bahamas.
Right.
And that's the only response I have, is to defaming the Bahamas. You know, you can make whatever allegations you wish.
Do you believe that there was any real fear that Bahamians should have been fearful at all about travel to South Florida?
Well, a couple of things operate. First of all, we had issued an advisory
Right.
to Bahamians generally traveling in Miami and in Fort Lauderdale, Dade and Broward County about where they kept their documents, because their cars were being broken into. It appears that Bahamians were being targeted by persons unknown in that area. So we had issued an advisory for people to be careful, period, about where they left their documents being followed and those sorts of things. So that's one aspect. But the second aspect has to do with raising the temperature, this political atmosphere. And we particularly got concerned when the diplomatic service of the U.S. State Department showed up on our doorstep one day and said, we're taking some additional measures to strengthen security around here because there's been a posting on Facebook where someone has threatened to breach the consulate, and we can't take any chances with that.
Right.
So it was at that point that we felt it was necessary to at least advise the public, do not get into any confrontations. We have no idea what this means or where it is, but just be careful, and that's the only thing, which is, of course, the same thing that the U.S. does with regard to criminal violence or in this country as well.
Right. So you spoke earlier about this time around making sure that you get to the bottom of it and resolve the length of the detention and the whole process in particular. Can you elaborate on that a little more so that we understand what it is exactly you're aiming to achieve?
Well, routinely, it takes a year or more for Cuban detainees to be processed through the system. That's ludicrous.
Yeah.
When Haitian migrants come to this country and in 3 days they're back in Port-au-Prince. And the same procedures are followed, which is established and have been at work. I've tried to put a stop to that. There's much institutional resistance to it. I'm saying put a stop to it. And that's, to me, the source of the problem, because the Cuban population that comes here is relatively small compared to the population of Haitians that come. Haitians come from the north of Haiti. They're largely uneducated peasants. People who come from Cuba, on the other hand, are fairly well-trained people. You're not going to have a well-trained group of people sitting around in a facility for 11 months without them agitating to get out of there. That's a natural thing to do. So it's just a source of problems. So my view is that the double standard ought to stop. Everybody should be treated together, and everyone should go home who's not judged to be an asylum.
Okay, well, clearly the lesson has been learned, and hopefully
hopefully we've learned the lesson.
Well, the lesson has been identified.
Ministers can say anything, you know.
Well, after the break, we'll come back and we'll talk a bit more about the diversity of the immigration situation here in the Bahamas, and speak in particular about Dominicans and the issues that are confronting us. So we'll talk about that when we get back after these messages.
We lost everything in the storm.
But thankfully, all was not lost because NUA had our backs.
Protect your home and valuables. NUA, the hands-on insurance agency.
Save the Bay says it's time for a new urgent fight. Environmental attorney Romy Ferreira tells us why.
We grew up hearing about majority rule, and we grew up hearing about independence, and that's fine. Now we're in a situation where the environmental degradation, you can't ignore it any longer. This is the fight of our time. Access to public beach, responsible development, enforcement of environmental laws. This is our generation's time. This is our time. Go online, sign the petition.
Let's go, save the Bays!
Welcome back to You and Your Money. Tonight's guest is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration, the Honorable Fred Mitchell. Before the break, we were talking about the issue with the Cuban immigrants. We're going to stick with foreign affairs just for a little bit longer and talk about our relationship with the Dominican Republic. The issue that we've been confronted with is the poaching. Talk us through that and tell us what the challenges are and what your goal is.
Well, I'm told that the fishery resources around the Dominican Republic are pretty much exhausted, so they go far afield, and one of the places they end up, I'm told, is the Bahamas. So our fishermen are very exercised about this issue. Now, the Cabinet in March of 2012, under Mr. Ingram, agreed that they would have discussions with the Dominican government over this. The government changed, and we adopted the policy, and we went to the Dominican Republic and have settled an agreement which is about to be signed on this fisheries issue, which is the most vexing issue between us. Problem is that in executing any agreement, you have to have the resources to back it up, and you know there's a shortage of manpower, shortage of boats, and all that. So I think the fishermen are quite unhappy about this. But government spent committed $200 million to buying new ships, so hopefully that will help with that issue shortly.
This would be another one of those ageless challenges that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would have been facing, because obviously poaching in general and poaching by Dominican ships has been a vexing issue for many, many, many years.
Yeah,
Do you think that we're very close with the agreement to seeing some sort of resolve?
Well, judging from the behavior of the Dominican government, it appears that they're committed to putting a stop to it, and they know that it's an irritant in our relations.
Right.
But as I said in answer to something earlier, you know, execution is always a problem, because you can sign anything and ministers can say anything. The problem is, does it actually work in the seas or on the ground, so to speak?
Well, it just shows that there are so many challenges that we face in generally protecting our borders. On the one hand, and that's both ministries have to work together.
Oh, yeah, we do.
Because you have the border protection issues regarding our seas and our property, but you also have the border protection issues involving immigrants, such as persons from Haiti.
Right.
How do you deal with both of those challenges, and where are we in protecting our borders against the unlawful migration of Haitians into our country?
It's another one of these very difficult and tortuous issues. The fact is, the country is relatively wealthy compared to Haiti, and so that's a driving force for people coming to this country. And of course, on the other side of us is the United States, which is the destination that most of them are trying to get to. So solving the problem is in part our own resources, but also the resources of the international community, and in particular the United States of America. So we've had discussions with the Haitian government. They too are committed to this, but they have a resource challenge themselves. One of the issues the president recently talked about when he was here was this question of investment of Bahamians in agriculture in the north of Haiti so people would stay home. We've talked about putting diplomatic agents in the north of Haiti so that we could have more intelligence gathering. We're also talking to the U.S. about tying into their intelligence sources as well. And of course, then there's an investment in equipment.
Right. So obviously the relationship between the Bahamas and the U.S. is going to be key in all of these initiatives.
Right.
So I want to talk a bit about the recent appointments, the Dr. Raming appointment as ambassador. Is that something we should have been embarrassed over
Well, I'm not embarrassed.
as a nation?
No, I don't think
happened?
so. Well, I think there was just delay, and he withdrew, so another person's been appointed, and that person is now going to take up office as soon as his credentials are presented.
Well, the delay, I understand, was not usual, but perhaps after the break, you'll entertain one final question on that and discuss the nature of that delay.
Sure.
So we'll discuss that when we come back after these messages.
Meet Neville and Carl. They both bought the same car on the same day. Neville is enjoying his new car, but Carl just can't relax. What's the difference? Neville has comprehensive car insurance from NUA, so no matter what happens, he knows he's covered. Isn't it nice to know NUA's got your back?
Carl, come to bed, please.
NUA, the hands-on insurance agency.
Save the Bay says it's time for a new urgent fight. Environmental attorney Romy Ferreira tells us why.
We grew up hearing about majority rule, and we grew up hearing about independence, and that's fine. Now we're in a situation where the environmental degradation, you can't ignore it any longer. This is the fight of our time. Access to public beach, responsible development, enforcement of environmental laws. This is our generation's time. This is our time. Go online, sign the petition.
Let's go, save the bays!
We lost everything in the storm.
But thankfully, all was not lost because NUA had our backs.
Protect your home and valuables. NUA, the hands-on insurance agency.
Welcome back to You and Your Money. We're talking here with the Honorable Fred Mitchell, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Immigration. Just before the break, we talked about the delay with the appointment of Dr. Ellison Raming, and I wanted you to just elaborate on that. Explain to us what caused the delay.
Well, if I recall correctly, this is from memory now. C.A. Smith, who was the ambassador before this, told me he was named sometime in August and got the agreement in November. So okay. I didn't consider it 3 months to be a delay. Okay. We were having discussions with the U.S. About this all along, and there's never a point where I manage the affairs of this country in foreign affairs where there's any confrontation or any notion of rejection by the U.S. of anybody. So it would never come to that. Never come to that. Because I told Colin Powell once, I was speaking to him on the phone, I mean, we know who the big boys are in this neighborhood, and no one's going to come up against that. But the fact is we are an independent country, and we have the space to operate with these things, and our relationship is quite open and good with them. The fact is there's not an ambassador here from the United States, and hasn't been since November of last year.
So you don't think that it was an issue at all with that candidate's character or personality?
Not as far as I'm concerned,
okay.
Right? And I'm unable to say that anything has been disclosed to us, which indicates that with regard to him from the other side. So, but what I'm saying is that on the 3rd of May, he decided to withdraw. It wasn't prompted by us. He said, fine, that's it. He withdrew, and we had a choice to make. Who was going to succeed?
Gotcha.
And we just said, well, easiest thing to do is to choose Dr. Nuri. Dr. Nuri was willing to do it, and that itself took about 3 months. So,
I see.
Yeah. So.
All right. Well, we talked about how busy your ministries have been since you took office, with the Cuban immigration issue, the issue with the appointment of the ambassadors, the Dominicans. Some persons have called for your resignation. Do you think it's unfair at this stage for that kind of talk, or is it just the way that the game is played?
Well, yeah, I mean, the leader of the opposition, he has to say that. But the Prime Minister decides who serves. I don't plan to resign, so I don't think there's anything to resign for. Certainly not based on what he described. What he described is certainly inaccurate, because there is no cover-up of anything. The whole thing is still under investigation, and the investigation, we've said, the chips let them fall where they may. So there's no effort by my part at all in that direction. But that's the way it is. It's, as I describe it, as an occupational hazard. Right. People say things, and I imagine next week the news will be something else.
Okay. Now I know that the the Department of Immigration in particular causes some peculiar challenges for persons who are using it. What do you have planned to either streamline the process, improve the process, dealing with work permits? What are we to expect from your ministries, I guess both from the passport standpoint and work permits? What's going to happen to make the process a lot easier for us?
Well, if I had my way and the resources, everything would go to electronics.
Right.
And that means for me, I've asked, there's an internal committee now of the the Department of Immigration that's generating an RFP, a request for proposals, for the next generation of electronics to do with applications for visas, immigration permissions, and so on and so forth. And this would mean to me that everything would be done online, and you'd be able to get a response online within a short space of time.
Weren't we expecting that already? Were there processes made for that?
Yeah, that's true. But when I came in and actually look at what they bought, all they bought was a system where you fill in the forms and they scan the forms and put it into the system, and that becomes a file. So all that is just transferring the writing that you do now into a kind of electronic file, but it isn't actually electronic application. And so that's the generation we have to get to.
Right.
When I was in Dubai, for example, and you see the Americans have some form of global, they call it, I think, global entry is what they call it. But essentially what you're able to do is to go to the border when you arrive, stick your passport in there, scan your eyes.
Right.
They identify you
Right.
immediately, and in 3 seconds you're through the border. You don't have to see an immigration officer at all. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to get to. And certainly with the work permit process, to make that more transparent and also to make it quicker.
Right. Well, since you ended with work permits, let me just ask you, do you think that your comments recently regarding work permits were that it was justified for some people to feel apprehensive about foreigners, for example, about doing business and starting new businesses in the Bahamas?
Well, they may. I can't really judge whether it does or it doesn't, but, you know, immigration is a blunt instrument. It's not a subtle thing. It's a policing operation largely. And at some points you have to send out a signal to a community, both the domestic community and the international community, that you can't take our rules and regulations for granted. Unfortunately, that's the consequence of it. And it's necessary. There has to be some discipline brought to the system. Clearly, you don't want to abuse people, and neither do you want to frighten them, because you do need the labor in the country. But, you know, as I said, immigration is a law enforcement issue, and unfortunately, law enforcement is a blunt instrument.
Right. So do you find that the persons, the civil service that support your both ministries, do you think that they are ready for the changes that you would want to see implemented?
Well, I think it takes a while for people to get used to the style of somebody who's new to an operation. And we're just basically putting together a team. You know, in our system, even though we have a 5-year term, essentially all you've got is 3 years to conduct your business. So we're in the middle of that before you enter a campaign again. And so there's still some work to do to put the team together. People are still learning a bit, and so it's going to be a little rough around the edges, but I think that we'll get some things done before we're actually in a campaign again.
Are there any priorities?
The priority for me is to stop these complaints in immigration of people saying things just take so long to get done. It's
Right.
so vexing, people losing files, you know. You're walking along the street and people pushing paper in your hand, this name, that name, so on and so forth. I applied 7 months ago, I applied 6 months ago, I haven't heard, I applied 2-3 years ago for things like permanent residence. And the thing that really vexes me is people whose spouses, because I believe that if you're a Bahamian and you marry someone, that person ought to have the same rights of access to everything in the Bahamas as you do.
Well, we're not going into constitutional reform, are we? Or
No, well, but it's a view of mine, and I hold that strongly.
And I think it's an honest view.
Right.
And I think many Bahamians believe. Is it possible for policy changes to be made to bring that into effect without the whole sweep of a referendum?
Well, that's a question that's probably best put to the Attorney General.
Okay.
My view is, on an examination of the Constitution, you can use the statute law to immediately allow women to have the same rights as men. I think you can do that, but you know, you'd have to leave that to the Attorney General. That's just my opinion. I think.
That's exciting news. But
Yeah.
I think that when we look at the both of the ministries that that you are responsible for? And correct me if I'm wrong, but they've always gone together, is that correct?
No, just since the Prime Minister Ingram, they've been together. Prior to that, I had Foreign Affairs and the Public Service. So Foreign Affairs and Immigration have been together under Brent Simonet, and this Prime Minister Christie, kept it. Before, I used to also have Foreign Trade,
That's right.
which is now resides with Ryan Pinda in a separate ministry. But we work closely together because one of the missions that Foreign Affairs has is to assist in finding some fresh money for our country, which is now in a capital deficit. And so that's one of the things we'll be doing over the next year.
Well, I see them as a natural fit together, but I
No
also
question.
see them as two huge responsibilities that maybe at some point in our development they may be separated, or do you think that would be...
Meaning immigration or trade?
Immigration and foreign affairs.
Yeah, but I think they are big. But, you know, this is a small country,
Right.
and, you know, what we say is big, I don't consider big at all. I mean, you know, basically, the country is 358,000 people. I mean, you know, I have this argument about the budget time. You know, we spend days and days and hours talking about a budget of $1.5 billion. You know, the school system in New York is $8 billion.
I understand. It's all relative.
Yeah,
It's
so, I
all
mean, you
relative.
know, it's nothing really. You know.
Is there anything that you would like to say to Bahamians, just going back very, very briefly to the issue with the Cuban immigration, the situation with that? Because a number of people have indicated that we have invested so much in South Florida that South Florida needs the Bahamas, and it's reciprocal. But so is there anything that you would want to say to Bahamians who believe that that relationship may be somewhat in jeopardy?
I don't think so. These people, this is what I'm saying, they specialize in rattling our cages, and unfortunately, you know, it's a psychological thing. It doesn't really have any resonance beyond those two counties and this small group of people.
Right.
And their progenitors at the national level in the states who are running for Congress and the Senate. So, you know, they're making political capital out of this. But I think generally speaking in Broward and Dade County, people are quite friendly with Bahamians. Most people didn't even know about the controversy at all if you spoke to them, right? So I wouldn't worry about that.
Well, I think with that note of comfort, that's a good place for us to end.
Sure.
We should be comfortable knowing that we can continue with our natural routine. So I thank you so much, Minister Mitchell, for coming here, enlightening us on the Cuban immigration situation, which has been very caused concern for us in the news, and telling us a lot about the initiatives and your plans for your ministry. So thanks very much for taking the time.
It was a pleasure.
Appreciate
Nice
it.
seeing you.
All right.
Yeah.
And with that, we end tonight's You and Your Money. Thanks for watching.
Still up on that world.